The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the virtual roundtable regarding the department's enforcement rule, which is being presented by Patricia Murphy, our Director of Compliance. Before we get started, we are going to go over a few housekeeping items. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a control panel. Keep in mind that that will automatically collapse during the course of this webinar. To open the control panel, you'll see an orange arrow, and you just click on that. When you open your control panel, you can select whether you want to call in to the dial-in number or use your computer's audio. If you choose the phone call, once you select the phone option, GoToWebinar will show you a phone number and access code. Use this information to call in. If you hang up and wish to call in again, you may need to wait for a few minutes so that the system recognizes that you are no longer logged in and allows you to complete your call. If you hang up and call back in right away, you may get a busy signal or some other error. Also, if you called in for the webinar with a dial-in number but did not register online, you will not be able to participate. You must use the link to register if you wish to speak. If you're having issues with your computer microphone, you can use the sound check button in the audio control to help troubleshoot. We will be utilizing, oh, that's the wrong one. I'm so sorry. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can submit the question through the questions box. Please give your name and your question, and a moderator will call on you to speak. I'm going to hand this over to Patricia, and we will get started shortly.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this virtual roundtable, which is sort of new to all of us, and I wish we were all in a room and face-to-face and could be having this discussion in person. But given the current circumstances, this is where we're at, and this is how we need to do this. So this session is being recorded, and I hope that doesn't discourage anybody from giving us input or asking questions, because that's what we're really after today, is your thoughts and ideas about this staff draft. And I'm just one of the presenters today. Isela Caseman is with me, and she's the secretary of the department's enforcement committee. Jeff Pender is also with us. He's a member of our legal division, and sort of questions about the statute or any kind of legal questions we'll be deferring to him. Ernest Hunt is also going to be participating. Wendy Quackenbush is with us. Cody Campbell, Abigail Versup is also on here. And so, although at this time I'm sort of spearheading this effort to get the enforcement rule going, I'm just sort of doing kind of the administrative parts of this and organizing stuff like this, and this is really a joint effort of the department staff. And so there's even the possibility I might say something wrong, and Isela will jump in and be like, well, actually, no, that's not how it works. No, this is not my area of expertise. This is just, I'm just moving this forward at this time. So we're all, we literally have been working on this. The staff draft that we posted, I was noticing some of the edits were from March of 2019. We really have been working on amendments to this for a very long time, and we came up with different ideas and thought, no, that doesn't work. So it's been a long time and a real group effort. So we are excited today to share with you our thoughts and our ideas, and we're looking for your input and thoughts about will this work, will this not work? So we're at the very early phases of rulemaking. So at this point, the staff draft and all that stuff that's on the website, our board has not seen that. So this is really just the beginning of the rulemaking process. We're doing this roundtable today to get your input. There's actually not that many people that registered to attend, which is why we're going to record this and make this so that more people will have the opportunity to understand what staff is thinking about all of this. And then it will go to our governing board as, I think we're probably going to do this as repeal and replace. And we'll still show everything and track changes, but since there are quite a few changes, we'll probably just do it as a repeal and replace instead of an amendment. But we'll still show you what's changing. And then it will go out for formal public comment. And so I think we need to acknowledge that we're seeking your input at this time, and we might not see eye to eye on everything. I know that I would call it maybe a low point of my career in the initial adoption of this holding these roundtables, and we did not see eye to eye on a lot of issues. And so we took feedback and said, this is what the staff thinks, you know, even though we've received this feedback. And then it does go out for formal comment. And that's when, you know, when stakeholders and department staff are not on the same page about what should be subject to an administrative penalty or what should be subject to debarment, that, you know, you give your reasons and we do our reasoned response. And then it's up to our governing board to make those decisions where we're not on the same page about issues. So that's kind of the process that we are going through. Again, we're sort of at the very beginning of rulemaking. So we do understand this is a really difficult topic for people to talk about. It's kind of a third rail, and that it's a hard thing to think who should be, you know, kicked out of the programs for a period of time. And you know, there's extenuating circumstances and why things happen, and you know, a lot of different scenarios that play out. So we're gonna, you know, talk about the changes we're thinking of and why, and we're seeking your input. Estella, is there anything you want to say at the beginning of this?
Yeah, just briefly, we just wanted to say, you know, Patricia, you did a great intro, but we just wanted to mention that we're not out to get anyone with these enforcement changes. We're not out to get anyone with the current rule or the changes that we're making. We don't keep any of the money that we collect from administrative penalties. My pay is not in any way related to how much we collect in administrative penalties, how many people we debar. It's completely unrelated. Our goal is always meaningful, lasting compliance. And so what these changes are intended to do is to address primarily those who are refusing to comply and those owners who aren't taking their compliance obligations seriously. You know, owners who are submitting things late, repeatedly failing to comply, and resulting in repeated referrals, sometimes for the same properties, sometimes for multiple properties in a portfolio. So we're really trying to address that issue. And what we're doing with a lot of these changes is formalizing an idea of progressive discipline, which is something we've implemented over the years to try to address properties and owners who have been a consistent problem for us. And so something you're going to hear a lot about today is this idea of progressive discipline and just trying to make sure that we can deter violations, because that's our primary goal with all of this, is deterrence, not necessarily punishment. But that's it for me for the intro. Patricia, do you want to jump in for Subchapter A?
Yes. Okay, so if I've done this correctly now, can you see on your screen Subchapter A?
I can.
You can. Okay, good. Thank you. All right. So on the department's website, I'll show you where we posted all of this stuff if you haven't found it yet. From the home page, if you go over to TDHCA rules, this is where we have posted the staff drafts that we're going to be discussing today. And so this is shown in black line and in clean. The black line kind of makes me crazy, but that's what we will kind of start with. So the first thing you can see in Subchapter A is that there's quite a bit of strike through of superfluous language. We're trying to just hear just what needs to be said and nothing more. So we got rid of some sort of language. Another thing that we have done is we have added a definition of actively monitored development. And this definition can also be found in the recently adopted previous participation rule. So we'll see later in this roundtable that we are looking at patterns in a portfolio where people have 5 or more actively monitored developments as a potential point of debarment. So an actively monitored development is defined as a development that within the last 3 years has been monitored by the department either through a uniform physical condition standards inspection or file monitoring review. UPCS inspections include inspections completed by department staff, department contractors, and inspectors from the Real Estate Assessment Center through federal efforts. So that's the definition of an actively monitored development. There's also a change in here about the committee members. Isela, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So I think just the primary changes to this are just to accommodate some input that we've received about membership restrictions. We've had some issues with not being able to get enough members on the committee. And so we've tried to just change it still to make sure that we don't have any conflicts, but to open it up a little bit more within the department. And also to show that we do have alternate members, because sometimes it's hard to get a quorum for a meeting. So that's, I think, most of our changes there.
Okay. And the other changes that we have made in Subchapter A, we kind of view as immaterial changes. So those are the kind of things that we wanted to point out for Subchapter A. And I guess we would like this as much as possible to be interactive. So if anybody has a question or wants to raise their hand or provide any comments or any questions about the changes to Subchapter A, we'll give you a minute now to do that. Renee, are we getting any hands raised or any indication that anyone has anything they want to address?
I have nothing on the questions box, and I do not see any hands raised for any questions.
Okay, great. All right. Chapter 2 contains 4 subchapters, A, B, C, and D. We are not at this time proposing amendments to Subchapter B. That is related to enforcement for noncompliance with program requirements of Chapters 6 and 7. That's the community affairs rules. And those were kind of recently amended, and so staff does not feel there's any need for changes to Subchapter B at this time. Okay, Isela, you're up with Subchapter C.
Sure. So Subchapter C is about administrative penalties. It goes over the entire process. And so we're suggesting a lot of procedural changes here so that we can more closely align the rule with the actual current process or the process that we want to have. We're not anticipating that very many of these changes would have much of an impact on people that are subject to penalties. But one section I did want to draw your attention to is B. We have changed it so that at the time of referral, so when an owner is referred for an administrative penalty, compliance or whomever does the referral would also request that the responsible party submit a listing of actively monitored developments in their portfolio. And the idea behind that is, again, this idea of progressive discipline. So we haven't got to the debarment rule yet, but when we do get to that, Patricia will go over a little more detail. This idea of actively monitored developments and larger ownership groups, and just trying to deter non-compliance. So what we'll do is, compliance or whomever's referring will request that list of actively monitored developments. And then I will look at it, compare it to my database to see who's been referred, and we'll use that to determine whether we need to also simultaneously consider the ownership group for debarment. And again, that's something we'll talk about a little bit more later, but that's one of the bigger changes that is in this section. Other than that, most of it, like I said, is procedural. It almost reads like an SOP in a lot of ways, but we felt it was really important to just show everybody, for transparency, how we actually process everything, so that you know what to expect. One part that is, I think, important is the section about plans. That's in section C. We put in there a section about plans. So if someone is referred for a penalty, but Patricia mentioned sometimes there are extenuating circumstances. Sometimes things happen and it wasn't planned. You didn't intentionally fail to comply, and you have a plan for resolution. What you would do is submit a plan as soon as you're referred. And so we put a little section about that in here so that the committee can consider plans potentially outside of the administrative penalty process. It also, let's see, yeah, it pretty much just goes, like I said, it just reads like an SOP through most of it. It does also have a lot of changes in the graphics. If you scroll down to section L, we have 3 sets of penalty schedules. So these schedules list all of the events of noncompliance for which we can assess a potential penalty. And the reason that we have,
look at them?
if you want, sure. So the reason that we have these figures is because our statute requires us to. So debarment and administrative penalties generally are both in our statute. And our statute at section 2306.042 requires us to have a penalty matrix so that we can be transparent about the maximum potential penalty that we could assess for each type of violation. And we use these tables in conjunction with the factors at 2306.042. These tables represent the maximum potential penalty for a violation, but they're not necessarily the penalty that would actually be assessed. The committee would sit down with someone, have an informal conference, discuss all of these factors in 2306.042, and then they would determine what an actual appropriate penalty is. But this table represents a baseline, the maximum they can't go above. Any adjustments would be below what you see in this table. So just to explain the table generally, you have the first column is your finding of noncompliance. Second column and third column, we made some changes here because there's been some confusion over the years about the idea of a first-time violation and a repeated violation. There were questions about, okay, well, is it the exact same violation? Unit 1 was over income during one review and it's over income again during the next review. We decided that was too specific. And what we decided to do for the second column is make it the maximum penalty possible for a responsible party that's previously paid a penalty of the same finding type. And so if you've had an agreed final order or you've gone through the formal hearing process and you've had a penalty paid before for one violation type and then you referred again for that violation type, that's when this third column would come into play. I have to admit, I don't know a lot about figure 1, which is community affairs. It relates to chapter 6 and 7.
Talk about that.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give it over to Ernest if you have anything for that figure 1.
Do you want to, should we talk about this one while it's up though, Isela? There's a couple things.
Sure, which one do you have up?
I'm sorry, I thought you could see my screen.
I do, yeah, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, multifamily. So multifamily is figure 2. We went over the general table there. I'm not going to go over the whole thing because it's like 20 pages long, but some of the big ones are, first on your page is UPCS, Uniform Physical Condition Standards. We have added an optional daily penalty if the violations remain unresolved after 6 months from the corrective action deadline, and that is to incentivize owners who are refusing to comply primarily. It's not something the enforcement committee would necessarily have to assess, that additional daily penalty, but we found that there have been some scenarios where owners are refusing to comply and they have some serious violations, but they don't have a lot of them. And so the maximum potential penalty is sometimes quite low. And so this is a way for us to incentivize them to actually make corrections as well as pay a penalty. We've had a few in the past who have just paid the penalty and did not make corrections. And so this is kind of addressing that. We've also added a lot of fair housing violations that weren't in there before. Just clarifying how we're going to handle fair housing and workforce commission violations. some of the numbers we've changed. We've also made some clarifications, I guess. So this is one section, social service requirements. What we found is that the maximum potential penalty often didn't align the incentives very well. So for our tax credit properties and our bond properties, supportive services are very different. For bond properties, there's generally an expenditure requirement per unit. And what we're finding was that the current penalty just doesn't align those incentives properly. So we split them up. Let's see, what else do we have?
So one thing I would jump in and say is that in the compliance rule in subchapter F of chapter 10, I think it's in 10.625, there's a chart that has all of the events of noncompliance, and that pretty closely aligns with this chart that you see here about the administrative penalty. And what Isela is doing here and the enforcement committee is doing, so in 10.625, I think it is, there's just a broad finding that says noncompliance with social service requirements. And if it's not resolved at the end of the corrective action period, we refer that to the enforcement committee. And they've broken it out into two kind of different events for their purposes for looking at, non-compliance with that type of finding. I think there's a few other ones where you did that, isn't there?
There are. Annual reporting, we did that as well. And you'll see the actual violation will be in normal text, and then you'll see our addition in parentheses usually when we're dividing it up or making some sort of clarification. So just as a rule of thumb, if when you're looking through this list, you'll see the finding of noncompliance in normal text, and then you'll see, kind of any subsections in parentheses. Yeah, so like this is another one, non-compliance with lease requirements. There are a lot of ways to not comply with the lease, and the seriousness of them varies. If you didn't execute required lease provisions, that's a lot more serious than not submitting a tenant rights and resources guide, for example. And so we split it up to make that make more sense.
Yes, so maybe, unless there's something else you want to comment?
Oh, I guess one other thing, just one last thing on this is that we did add the Section 811 program, which isn't currently in the matrix at all. And so a lot of this final step at the end will be for the Section 811 program, which has only just started to be implemented. And there are a number of 811, I think it's a couple pages worth of 811 program violations. And there are also a few where we just haven't figured out what an appropriate penalty amount is. So if you see one that doesn't have a penalty amount in here, that doesn't mean that it won't have a penalty. We just haven't decided what the appropriate amount will be. But the maximum potential penalty for a violation is $1,000 per unit per day, or per violation per day. So that's the maximum that the blanks could be.
Right.
That's it for multifamily rental violations. Did you want to go to community affairs or single family next?
I would like to see if anyone has any input.
Sure.
Renee, anyone have anything to say about any of this?
We are silent on that front.
They're silent. Okay. So, if you think that there's some sort of an event that should be subject to an administrative penalty that's not in that chart, or if you think we can't go above $1,000 per day, right, Isela?
That's right.
Right. So if you look at that and think that should be $5,000 a day, that's not a comment that we can accommodate. But if there's some of them you think, well, I don't think that one should be up to $1,000 a day. Remember, it's a maximum, and so it could be quite a bit less than that. Those agreed final orders are generally quite a bit less than the maximum that could be assessed. But that's something that, if you have any input on, we are open to hearing about.
Patricia?
Actually, to Patricia's point there. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say.
There was someone that raised their hand.
Oh, great. Good. Someone's going to participate.
Okay.
Wonderful.
So this is Elizabeth Rome, and I'm going to unmute her and see what questions she has. She just raised the hand, so she didn't indicate in the questions box. So I'm going to unmute her. Really quick. Oh, she just unraised her hand.
Oh.
I'm going to unmute her anyway. Elizabeth,
Thank you. Hi.
do you have a
Hi.
question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today and for participating.
Thank you. Yes, this is my first roundtable of any kind, so I wasn't sure when to jump in, but just as far as what you've discussed so far, I just wanted to say that, so I'm a staff attorney at Texas Housers, and as you all know, we've been involved in this for a long time. I just want to say that we're really pleased to see a lot of these changes that you just discussed, in particular the addition of the fair housing violations to that list for administrative penalties, and in particular the day-by-day addition that you discussed on row 1 of the multifamily. In addition to, I know that we've moved on from, I believe this was in Subchapter A, but since we already passed it, really pleased seeing that change in the process that's allowing for the opportunity to look for problems across a developer's portfolio when they come up with an enforcement violation. So just really appreciate seeing that thought going into that process so that those can be caught when that's occurring. So those are my comments for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, Elizabeth maybe got the ball rolling. Anyone else want to participate and say anything? Up to someone else have their hand raised? I see a flashing thing.
I see Elizabeth, but let me unraise her hand. Lower. Let me look.
I did have one thing I wanted to mention, just to Patricia's point about how our orders are often a lot lower than these maximum penalties. That is true. So it's this idea of progressive discipline. So maybe I should mention that a little bit and what we mean by that. So we don't typically, like we said before, our goal is compliance, meaningful compliance. And we recognize that things happen. You know, sometimes you'll be referred for a penalty and it's a legitimate mistake. If you've just been referred one time, we're going to work with you. So generally how it works is that the first time you come through the committee, we would resolve it informally. Nothing would happen. Generally the second time you would, unless it's corrected before I set an informal conference, it would go to an informal conference with the enforcement committee. Generally the first time before the enforcement committee, they would typically set a partially forgivable penalty. And they would tie the penalty to the corrections. And so in most cases, they would have a total penalty and then they would forgive part of it if you submit corrections by a certain date that they work out. But it does progress from there. Typically that first agreed final order is pretty low. Like Patricia said, it's usually not anywhere near this maximum, but it does ramp up. If we're dealing with an owner that's had consistent problems, they've been through the enforcement committee a lot, they're not complying, they're not making improvements, each time they come through, the penalty is going to be more. And so we do have a number of properties where they are getting the maximum penalty each time they come through. But we're hoping that these changes will perhaps better align incentives a little bit for those properties in particular. With that said, if it's a property that's distressed, we do still try to work with them. And so it really does depend on what comes up during that informal conference. It really does inform how we determine what an appropriate administrative penalty will be, keeping this table in mind. So just wanted to mention that a little bit so you understand how it works.
Oh, and before we jump to Ernest to explain those other tables to us, let's show the audience where they can find all of these things.
Patricia,
yes?
I do have someone that has raised their hand.
Oh, great.
I believe the name is Mark Bethune. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that, but I'm going to unmute him.
Hi, Mark.
Good morning. And yes, it is Bethune. I've certainly heard worse. I understand that the goal of the penalties is corrective action, and I certainly agree with that. And you may have touched on this already. Where do the penalties go? Is that general fund or just enlighten me?
General fund, yeah, they just go to the treasury. Yeah, we don't get to keep them.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, is there anyone else, Renee?
No, ma'am. Not at the moment.
Maybe more people will speak up. Okay, so before we move on to Ernest, who's going to explain those other penalty tables to us, I want to show people So from the department's homepage under board, if you go to orders, this shows the debarment orders. So 4 parties have been debarred that you can see there. And then, there's also expired debarment orders. I don't really know if are there any expired debarment orders that are available?
So the reason that they're split up is that we had someone who was debarred in the past who asked to have his order removed. And so we did remove the link to the order. It's still something you could request through a public information request, but he asked that it be taken off the website. So we split them up so that you can actually read the current ones, but the old ones you can't. So,
okay, so there are the debarments. And then if you go through here, see, these are all of the administrative penalty orders that they're here. And I think they're almost all multifamily, aren't they, Isela?
Yes, I've had, I want to say 2 or 3 community affairs and 1 single family. And the rest of them are all multifamily. Yes.
But so you can look through those and see the amounts of the penalty. So it can be like 8 pages of violations there, followed by a $200 forgivable penalty. So they're all there for you.
Unless there's a history, in which case it's a lot. You'll see there are a few of these. If you look at the list, you'll see there's some of them that are repeated, and those typically do get close to the maximum penalty, if not the maximum penalty. But you'll see a pattern if you look at those from the bottom up.
Right. And so these, they go to our board almost every month, and they're on the consent agenda in general, unless somebody asks to pull them off. But so if you're ever interested, that's where they are. Okay, Ernest, are you ready?
I am. Good morning.
All right, let's get to the stuff that we're going to ask you. Can you talk about both of those, even though I only told you you'd have to talk about the community affairs one?
I believe so.
I think you can too.
I think the thing I want to bring to everyone's attention is that this is not, and you guys have already kind of alluded to this, this is not a replacement for our normal corrective action process. And so I didn't want there to be any confusion about that. The penalty tables that we're discussing are not new, but the template is rooted in multifamily development. So the bulk of the changes are really an attempt to clarify and remove language that's not really applicable either to community affairs or to the single family program. And so with that in mind, if it's okay, I'd really like to just kind of touch on the changes that are in place really to provide clarification. And then we could take any questions after that point.
So I pulled up the penalty table for chapter 6 and 7, and that should be able to right now.
Okay. So scrolling through the penalty table, you'll see that we're removing the violation for the Texas Public Information Act. Again, that's something more specific as far as our enforcement responsibilities for multifamily development. So we took that language out. The changes to violation of procurement requirements further down the table, really it's just it's a one-term change to kind of encompass all of the potential procurement violations that we might deal with post monitoring and corrective action process. And scrolling even further down, we wanted to be really specific about the changes for board requirements for chapters 6 and 7, and it's really specific to one program, and it's specific to one requirement for tripartite board requirements, specific to CSBG. We took out assurance, the violation regarding assurance 16 activities, as that's not a activity that we're still providing at the, from the department. Failure to complete or properly complete a process required by Chapter 5 is not applicable, so we took that out. We wanted to ensure that, or further down the table, failure to input HHSP or EH client data into HMIS. That's specific to our homeless programs, but we wanted to make sure that that was clear. It encompasses all of our homeless programs. Non-compliance with material installation standards is again specific to multifamily development, so we took that out. We wanted to clarify further down where it references fair housing violations for these programs. We're talking about accessibility. And we also have a requirement for information privacy and security. We've got an agreement that is associated with that requirement. It's something that's very important for the department to maintain record of, and so that's a new addition to the table. Fortunately, we've got staff available to provide further information on the actual agreement. But again, this is something that goes out with all contracts to ensure that we are capturing the proper information for information privacy and security. And like I said, I didn't want to kind of regurgitate the whole table because this is not new.
Yeah, not a lot of changes.
But I do want to entertain any questions if there's anything on the table that anyone would like to discuss.
Renee, do we have anyone that wants to talk about this penalty table?
No, ma'am.
No?
No hands are raised, no questions in the box.
Okay. Let's go to the next one. Ernest, can you talk about this one?
Yes. Let me bring it up just a moment here. I can read it better from the website, so I'm trying to get to the proper, there we go, single family. Similar, or actually the exact same as with community affairs programs, because the requirements of the penalty table are rooted in multifamily development. We provided some clarification language in this as well. Remove the language regarding affirmative marketing requirements.
Looks like we did. That's a staff error. Remember, see how it's deleted, but then it's in the next row?
Let me see.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do this. Repeal and replace.
Yeah, I gotcha.
Still have a finding for a penalty for non-compliance with affirmative marketing requirements for our single-family programs.
Thank you. We did clarify fair housing violations to include to clarify as accessibility.
So Ernest, I'm going to interrupt you there. So if I understand what this means, it's because there's a part of 2306 that requires like single family homes have certain, like, don't they have to have like a no step entrance, and is that what this is talking about, that it's not actually, that doesn't align exactly with fair housing? Is that why we're making this change?
It is more of, I mean, without getting into specifics, but certain things about the height of utility boxes within the home, no step entry, things of that nature. Okay. And those requirements are rooted in the home requirements for accessibility.
Got you. So it's just saying you could have to comply with 504 or whatever your accessibility standard is. It's not specific to fair housing. If you have an accessibility requirement and you didn't meet it, it's going to go under this thing, right?
That is correct. If we scroll down even further, you'll see that we removed failure to comply with mortgage loan policies. Again, that's something really more specific to multifamily development. Let's see.
Looks like they added one about Chodos.
I believe the Chodo requirement there. I'm trying to see, did we modify something there? Perhaps we modified the amounts. The failure to meet Chodo board requirements, I believe, was part of the original template. Nope, we added it. And so Chodo board requirements are, it's a very important requirement handed down to us by HUD. And so it was something that needed to be added to the table. That's why you see it here.
We talked about that.
Scroll down past
Would you like to talk about any other violation? This is one of your favorites, isn't it?
Should I jump in for this one? This is Isella.
Please
Sure.
do.
How do you or Jeff?
Sorry to interrupt, Ernest. I just realized I didn't mention this in the other section, and this is one of the really important changes. So this is any other violation of Texas Government Code, Chapter 2306, or rule or order adopted under the Texas Government Code, Chapter 2306. We've never used this line because our attorneys say that it's inappropriate. Our attorneys think that these tables need to be fully inclusive, and that if the violation is not in this table, that we should not pursue a penalty because there are issues, just legal issues with notice there. So we've removed this from all three tables. So, okay, back to you, Ernest.
Thank you for that. I couldn't have explained it as well.
Was somebody else going to talk there? Was that you, Jeff?
No, that was me. Can you repeat where to find the penalty schedule?
Sure. So the draft ones that we are looking at are on from the home page. My screens are acting crazy. From the home page, go to TDHCA rules and regulations. And then the page will refresh. And we have been looking at, first we did this multifamily one, then we did chapter 6 and 7. And now we're looking at the single family program violations. So these are drafts. And then that's what we're looking at now. And if somebody wanted to look at the ones that are actually in effect right now, you would go to TDHCA rules, chapter 2 enforcement, subchapter C administrative penalties. And are they in this part?
They're inside 2.302.
Thank you.
Very bottom.
So the ones that are in effect right now are these attached graphics right here on your screen. Okay. So Ernest, oh no, this is not the right one. I'm sorry, let me get back to, where was I with that? The one you were going over.
It was the single family one.
Yes.
Yep, now I have too many windows open. I'm sorry. This is it. Okay, so we're at failure to submit inventory report.
Yes. Trying to make sure I'm not muted here. So we further down the list, we see failure to submit inventory report. Some of our programs have an inventory requirement, a report requirement, as we in turn have to maintain those ledgers for our funding sources. And this requirement is as a result of that. One of the bigger items we wanted to make sure we included are specific to single audit. And so, as you know, more and more importance has rests on the shoulders of our review of single audits, not only for our risk assessment, but in compliance with requirements of Uniform Administrative Standards under 2 CFR 200. This penalty aligns with that, and it's part of our single audit review process in the event that someone is not adhering to the requirements to upload them to the, Federal Audit Clearinghouse and provide them, make them available for review. And again, we also have the information privacy and security agreement requirement that's across all programs, and so we want to make sure to include that here as well.
All right. Does anyone have any questions about the penalty table for this department's single family programs?
We have no questions.
I guess I have a quick comment.
Great.
Ernest made a really good point. It's something I didn't mention when I was going through administrative penalties generally, but we don't typically assess an administrative penalty or go through the administrative penalty process if things are corrected during the corrective action period. So this is all assuming that you had some sort of monitoring review or inspection, you went through the entire corrective action period, and you didn't submit complete corrections, or you didn't submit corrections at all. That happens sometimes. And so this is entirely to deal with that situation where you have not complied. You're either refusing to comply or you're repeatedly complying. There's one exception, which is if you have repeated violations for the same issue, there are some situations where you might be referred for that. But I think debarment is likely what would come into play in that situation under this proposed amendment. And that's something Patricia will talk about a little bit.
Thank you. So no questions. How about any other staff members or any other TDHCA staff that wants to jump in and say something I forgot to say? Or Jeff, do you have any comments? Wendy, Cody, anyone?
Oh, you guys are doing great.
Okay. All right. Now we're going to talk about Subchapter D, which is the department's rule that is related to debarment. And we are making some, or suggesting some changes here. So first, I think we need to start with, what does the statute say? So it's in Texas Government Code 2306.0504. So it provides that a person may be debarred on the basis of the person's past failure to comply with any condition imposed by the department in the administration of its programs. So that's a may, or you might get debarred for past failure to comply. And you shall be debarred if you materially or repeatedly violate any condition imposed by the department in connection with the administration of a department program, including a material or repeated violation of a land use restriction agreement regarding a development supported with an allocation of housing tax credits. So there's the you may be debarred, and then you shall be debarred. And so the changes that you are going to see that we are proposing are actually moving a lot of the stuff from you shall be debarred for these things up to you might get debarred, you might not get debarred, but it's something that you might get debarred for. And so this is the part of the rule where we're kind of defining, we're definitely in this part of the rule defining what is a material or repeated violation. This is where we're spelling out, these are the material or repeated violations that you shall be recommended for debarment for. So keep in mind, and we're looking for your feedback about those issues. And well, let's just jump in now and look at what you might get debarred for. And I'm going to do my best to remember which things are new and which things just got moved up from the shall debar, from the single family or community affairs stuff. All right, so I'm gonna scroll down here, and we're gonna go to, okay, so here we jump right in and say the department may debar a responsible party, a consultant, or a vendor who's exhibited a past failure to comply with any condition imposed by the department. And you may be referred for the committee for debarment for any of the following. Okay, so the first one is kind of rewording a concept that's already in the rule, that if you've been placed on a modified cost reimbursement plan and you're just not able to submit a plan to implement and adhere to procedures to ensure compliance. So this is kind of looking at our community action agencies and our nonprofits that are running TBRA and stuff like that. Note that the use of the word refusing. So you're going to see in this that we're really focused on people or organizations that just refuse to comply. The next one's refusing to pay a disallowed cost, refusing to enter into a plan to repay your disallowed costs or egregious violations of the agreed plan. The next one, we cleaned the language up a little bit. So in the department's multifamily rules in section 11.202, there's a long list of people that are ineligible applicants. And we cleaned up the language there that it's not necessarily about conflicts of interest. Like, for example, if you were the executive director of TDHCA, you're an ineligible applicant for, I don't know, I think it's 2 years or something like that. And so that doesn't mean we're going to recommend you for debarment just because you're the former executive director. So it's just cleaning up the language a little bit. The next one's not new. It's been there about providing fraudulent information, knowingly falsified documentation, or other intentional or negligent misrepresentation, material misrepresentation or admission with regard to documentation, certification, or other representatives. So this is the fraud. The next one, Isela, you want to talk a little bit about this one?
Sure. So this next one is to address agreed final orders that have been signed for an administrative penalty, but that were violated and that corrections were not made. So basically what we're doing here is saying, if you violate your order, you either refuse to pay or you refuse to make corrections, and you don't eventually correct them, we would refer you for debarment under this. The timeline there is within 6 months of demand. So let's say you violate your order, you still have an opportunity to correct your violations, but we want to make sure that you do correct your violations. And if you don't correct them, at that point, you would be referred for debarment.
The next one is we're adding in that if there's a foreclosure or a deed in lieu of foreclosure that terminates your TDHCA LURA, and note the language there that it's after the effective date of this rule. So if you're controlled a multifamily development that went through a foreclosure in 2014, this wouldn't affect you. It's after the effective date of this rule. The next two are really kind of the same. About if there's a change in ownership of a multifamily development and you don't get approval, you could be recommended for debarment. And we want to point out it's kind of like even worse if you did that and there was a right of first refusal that you blew off in your LURA. That really will recommend you for. We may recommend you for debarment, and you'd have to come up with why you shouldn't be debarred about that in case there's some extenuating circumstances. The next was someone going to jump in and say something? Okay. The next one is if you're involuntarily removed by your general partner under your limited partnership agreement. Again, that's after the effective date of this rule. The next one is, so when you go through a previous participation rule, review, your application may be recommended for approval subject to conditions. Like conditions might be you need to attend a training class or hire someone to review your files or something like that. And so if you agreed to that and then you refuse to do it, after the effective date of this rule, you might get debarred. Oh, the next one is, again, because it's something new, after the effective date of this rule, if you have an event of noncompliance, that requires us to repay federal funds. We debar you. So that could be you have to repay LIHEAP funds or HUD funds. So if your noncompliance puts the department in a situation where we need to come up with some source of revenue to repay the federal government, you might get debarred. The next one is about, there are certain times where we went out and monitored a property and we identified noncompliance. And instead of requiring the owner to submit backup documentation of that they restored compliance, we accepted a certification. And if we discover that that certification was not true, then the person who signed the certification may get debarred. These are new ones about refusing to provide an amenity that's required by your LURA. Reserve units for Section 811 participants, failing to notify us about the availability of Section 8 units. Okay, now we're moving into things that were a shall debar, either in the community affairs section or the single family section. So these things used to be you shall be debarred, and we're moving them up to you might be debarred. If you take choice limiting actions prior to environmental clearance, you have substandard construction, you fail to provide match, you fail to report program income, you participate in activities that give the appearance of a conflict of interest, you have repeated material financial system deficiencies, you repeatedly violate single audit or other programmatic audit requirements, you don't maintain a CHODO for developments that are committed with home funds, commingling and misapplication of funds. We got the single audit thing in there again. Oh, you don't respond to reports or provide required correspondence. And then the last two are new. And so this one probably we need to amend this when we bring it out about after the date of this rule that you fail to timely expend funds. So if you're awarded a contract like the CARES Act funds or whatever, and you're supposed to be serving your community, and we award you funds and you're supposed to use the funds to help people in your community, and you fail to take action and sit on the money, that we may debar you and say we don't want to do business with you in the future or for some period of time. This one as well needs on or after the date of the rule. If we go to monitor you, and this is either, this is for any of our programs that have an eligibility requirement, an income eligibility requirement. If we go out and monitor you and half the files we look at don't have any documentation to indicate that the households are eligible, or that documentation shows the household's not eligible, that we'll consider debarment for you. And I'm wondering if we have any input, questions, feedback. I'm not digging this virtual roundtable. I can't see your faces to see what the look on your face about your outrage, any feedback at all.
I do not see anyone with their hands raised. Elizabeth Rome just asked a question, so I'm going to unmute her.
Okay.
And that way she can ask her question.
Great.
Elizabeth, you are unmuted. Can you hear us? Oh, hold on. Hold on a second. Elizabeth, you might be self-muted. Oh, you are self-muted.
I was self-muted. Apologies.
No worries.
It's Elizabeth Ream again with Texas Housers. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you determined which actions would result in required versus optional debarment, like how you thought that through. I know some is statutory, but it might not be. So wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, obviously, as the Compliance Division, we drove a lot of this, and we look at how things impact the people that live in our affordable housing communities and low-income Texans that should be receiving assistance under our community affairs and single family programs. And we also got input from all of the division directors about, from a programmatic standpoint, what sorts of things, you know, for example, like could end up in the newspaper, right? You know, or just really are like a poor reflection of the department or our programs. That was kind of the idea behind what sorts of things should we say, you know, no. Like, for example, if you, like that one that we added about ERAC violations. So if you have this history of non-compliance and you come to us and say, I want more money, and the board says, well, okay, but you need to do these things. And then you take your money and you walk off and don't do what the board told you to do. That's not great. Or like the one that Isela talked about people who have gone through the penalty process and they ended up with an agreed final order and they pay the money and they just don't comply, right? That's, you know, like, oh, we're not being effective here in administering our programs. So that was sort of some of the logic. And note that a lot of the stuff we're pulling from shall debar to may debar. So, you know, like if you don't turn in your single audit, you might get debarred, but, you know, I don't know, maybe the executive director passed away and the finance position's open and you're, you know, like there's some storm of events that explains why this is late and you're able to demonstrate all the efforts you're making to get this done in time. You've never been late before. You've never had findings in your audit report before. Should you really get debarred for that? Maybe, maybe not, versus someone who, you know, year after year says, I'm working on it, and doesn't turn it in. That's different, and they maybe should be debarred. You know, not forever, right? We're going to talk about terms, but, you know, to say, hey, this is serious, pay attention, you know? So does that answer your question, Elizabeth?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Yeah, so it sounds like as far as distinguishing the may versus the shall category, it was a lot about kind of which things should merit a second chance and could have some type of explanation versus what might not or is required.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Anyone else? Were there other questions, Renee?
I don't have any other questions. So if you guys would like to ask a question, you can ask through the questions box, or there is a raise your hand function. So if you want to ask a question, you can go those two routes. But as of right now, I have no one asking any questions or their hands are not raised.
Okay. All right. So those are the may debar things. And so note it's on the basis of the person's past failure to comply with any condition imposed by the department in the administration of its programs. And so if you're thinking, well, you should get debarred for lying on an application, you know, I don't know if the department can because it's not the past failure to comply. So I know there's times where people think, well, someone should be debarred for that. And if you look at the statute, it's pretty specific about you may get debarred for this and you shall, we're defining now what is you shall depart for repeated and material violations. Okay, so if there's no other questions, we're going to move into the you shall be referred for debarment. And we switched up the multifamily stuff quite a bit. And so looking at what used to be considered material violation. So for example, whoops, does this show everything? There used to be all of this stuff in here about, okay, so if 2 times you didn't have a hub, you didn't meet additional state and rent and occupancy restriction, or you didn't have services. So the rule that's in place right now looks at one property and says 2 times in sequential visits did we go out and find one of these events. And so you might have a portfolio of 50 properties, and you might have a pretty good track record, and 2 times you mess up the utility allowance, or 2 times you forget to do this executed lease provision stuff, and we really thought this is not appropriate. Or we had someone who triggered one of these things and we referred them and we're like, well, we also should be telling them about all of these other things that are going on in this owner's portfolio. So we're really moving to, for the multifamily stuff, we're looking at, there are, no matter what your portfolio size, there are some things that if that happens, that's material and we're gonna refer you for debarment. And then there are other things that if you control 5 or more actively monitored developments and we're seeing these patterns, then we're going to refer you for debarment. So, okay, so what we're going to look at is no matter your portfolio size. So if 2 sequential monitoring visits, you are out of compliance, we left in the nonprofit or the hub. Okay, so that one, if we only come to monitor you every 3 years, you're supposed to have a hub or a nonprofit materially participating according to your land use restriction agreement, and 2 times in a row you go out there and you don't, you're just blowing it off, that is a material violation, or we consider that to be a material violation. This next one is after the effective date of the rule. If 2 times we come out to monitor you and you score below a 70 on UPCS, we consider that to be a material violation of the program. The next one is after the effective date of this rule, for 2 consecutive years, if you don't turn in your annual owner's compliance report. And we mean you don't, not that you report late, but that you don't reply to us or report to us at all. Remember, we only can monitor you once every 3 years. And in the intervening years, the way you sort of say, I'm still out here and complying with this program, is you turn in your annual owner's compliance report. So if 2 years go by and we don't hear from you at all, basically we don't know if you're participating in the program anymore, and we're gonna recommend you for debarment. 2 times you're overcharging rents. That is another thing that we consider a material violation of the program. Okay, the next one is on or after the effective date of this rule. If half of your actively monitored developments have been referred to the enforcement committee, so no matter what it's for. So if you have a portfolio of 20 properties and 10 of them or more have been referred to the enforcement committee, you really have a significant, we are proposing to define that as a significant repeated material violation. Likewise, if 50% or more of the actively monitored developments in your portfolio score a 70 or less. So I'm going to take a minute and show you guys something. And where is, now I pulled up a report of UPCS scores and now I can't find it, which is not good. So I'm going off my head here. Or we pulled up the most recent 2,189, here it is, I found it. Okay, so here we have, there's the scores for, I want to say there's 2,000 of these properties that we have done an inspection. So this is the most recent score, for 2,189 properties. And here is the score for everybody. And so if you look at those, we have this many properties that scored below a 50. So there's only like 10 of them that scored below a 50, which is like 0.0004% or something like that. And there's only this many properties that scored below a 70. So we are really not talking about a big portion or percentage of the department's portfolio. And so what we're saying, there's like 66 of these properties. And if they are, our low scoring properties are actually owned by one person that's controlling them, then that is someone that is materially and repeatedly out of compliance and should be debarred from the program. So there's two considerations in here about UPCS scores, because the current rule is about a 50, and so we left that in, and we added in the other ones. Okay, are there questions about this or comments, or do we have anything, Renee?
No, ma'am. Nobody has any questions.
No comments about that? Nothing?
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay. I don't like virtual roundtables. Moving on. Okay. So that's the multifamily stuff. And then for the community affairs and the single family programs, we moved pretty much almost everything to you might get debarred, and so we condensed it here. And so this is debarment for all other department programs with the exception of the community services block grant. So CSBG is its own special program. It's an entitlement program that there's designated agencies that receive those funds. And there's a whole separate process that happens for terminating an eligible entity status, and that runs its own course. So for they're by themselves, we've got something for multifamily and for everybody else. So these are the ones for all the other programs. So we've changed this to, it used to say excessive loan defaults in the first 12 months of a loan agreement, and we're changing it to 50% or more of the loans that you make a default in the first 12 months of your loan agreement, and that's after the effective date of rule. If you refuse to allow us to monitor, or you refuse to provide us the documents we need to monitor, we need to recommend you for debarment. So if you get our money and then absolutely refuse to open your books and let us monitor you and see what you're doing with the money, that we're just pass through, remember, we can't do business with you anymore if we're not able to verify what you're doing with funds. If you refuse to comply with procurement requirements, So that's a pretty specific. It's not you make a procurement mistake. It's you just will not comply with procurement requirements. Then that's too big of a risk to the department because procurement is required, and you will recommend you for debarment. And then we have Davis-Bacon Act violations. If you refuse to pay restitution, if you refuse to pay liquidated damages, under the Uniform Relocation Act, it's these specific findings that would say, we would say, it's too material and you're too much of a risk for the department to continue to provide you with funds because you are failing in significant ways that are a risk to the department. And then this stuff, you can see we moved up to you might get debarred. Oh, if you refuse to reimburse excess cash on hand. So if you draw down funds and you're not using it for program purposes and you won't give it back to us, we're going to recommend you for debarment. Okay, the next one is a new one. And we very rarely have this. And if this happens, then we need to recommend you for debarment. There's some of the department's programs, you can do like home ownership programs. And so you could have an existing person that they have a house and it's not suitable for occupancy. And so you use department funds to tear the house down. And if you refuse to rebuild their house and leave them homeless, we will recommend you for debarment. The other one is if you're drawing down department funds, you're telling us you're drawing down the department funds for the purposes of paying vendors, and that's not what you do with the money, and you refuse to pay the vendors, we'll recommend you for debarment. So that's the list of things that we went over the may, and then we did multifamily shall, and then we did all other programs, but for CSVG, you shall be recommended for debarment. And the rest of this rule goes through the process that you get referred to the enforcement committee. And then they, Isela, do you want to jump in here and talk about the rest of the process?
Yeah, sure. So I guess one big change I should mention is under the current rule, only the compliance division can refer for debarment. That's one big change in this rule, is that any division can now refer for debarment. So that's one thing to mention. So the division will refer someone for debarment, either any responsible party, person, ownership group, whatever. We'll set an informal conference, and at that informal conference, they'll talk about all the factors that are relevant. And one thing you probably noticed is missing in this rule is a suggested debarment term. We did at one time in the past have suggested debarment terms for each type of violation, but we found that that was counterproductive because it forced our hand. For some people, it would require a very long debarment period. For some people, it would require a very short debarment period. And so what we found is that it makes more sense to have that informal conference to talk about all the factors that relate to the reason that the individual was referred for debarment, and to use those to formulate an appropriate debarment term. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge debarment term. We recently had one that was like 6 months. On the extreme side, I've had one that was 20 years. And so it really does vary that much. And I would expect that for some of the more minor types of violations, it would probably be on that low end. For the repeated violations and for the refusals, I think it would be on the high end. So it really depends on what the violation is. But we would have that informal conference. You would have an opportunity to either agree or disagree. If you agreed, it would just go to our board on the consent agenda, and your debarment would be finalized. If you disagreed with the term, you can appeal to our board, but under the current rule and this updated rule, the board does have the ability to increase or decrease the debarment term. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And it has happened before that our board has increased the debarment term. We had one where we recommended 10 years and they doubled it to 20. And so that it does happen, it is possible. But that's it for the process. It's a very simple process. There is no further right to appeal. It really does just go to our board. Whereas for administrative penalties, you would have an informal conference, you'd have an opportunity to agree, potentially sign an agreed final order. But if you didn't agree with the penalty recommendation, you would have the ability to appeal to the State Office of Administrative Hearings for a formal contested case hearing. That remedy doesn't exist here for debarment. It's purely done within the agency and will be finalized by our board. A couple of things I did want to mention. I was just taking notes as Patricia was talking about debarment. First thing I wanted to highlight again, all of our divisions can now debar or refer for debarment. And I think refusal is something I wanted to really highlight, is that you'll see that kind of running theme throughout a lot of these added violations is this refusal to comply. So if you're referred and you start working with us, that's something that the committee would take into consideration. It's really owners who are absolutely refusing to comply that we're looking at for those lines where we say refusal. I also wanted to highlight the effective date of the rule. You'll notice a lot of these things that we've added, and Patricia highlighted that today, was that we're considering actions as of the effective date of this rule or after the effective date of this rule. So for example, the UPCS violations with a score of 70 or below, we're looking at the future for those. Obviously, if you're 50 or below, that's in our current rule, so we can consider that. But if it's 70 or below and repeated, that's something we would consider going forward. One part of that is just due process, but the other part of that is that we want to incentivize people to make improvements to their properties. So we're kind of putting people on notice about our expectations and saying, hey, this is what we expect. This is the minimum standard that we expect. And we expect you to start making improvements. If you're in this category and you know up front that you're in this category, you need to make some changes. And so that's kind of something that we're hoping that this rule will help to bring about. I think that's it for me for my notes that I have here. Did you have anything else you wanted me to go over, Patricia, for debarment?
I can't think of anything.
Okay.
Jeff, do you have anything to add?
No, I'm good.
All right.
Renee, any questions? Any participation at all in our virtual roundtable?
Elizabeth has her hand raised again. I will unmute her.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, can you hear us?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Great. Don't mean to dominate the roundtable, but since you're asking for input, just wanted to say that I'm really supportive of, again, the changes that you just discussed. Really like that any division can refer to debarment. That seems great from an external perspective, and also imagining, things going on internally. That sounds more efficient and like a great way to make sure that if anyone within TDHCA catches some violation, that they're able to efficiently get it to those that need to know. I know we skimmed through those UPCS inspection score items above, and Texas Housing is very supportive of those changes, the multiple violations of the scoring of 70 or below. And you may have stated this, but was that spreadsheet that you showed of the UPCS scores, is that public on the website?
It is not public on the website. It's available under open records, though.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's good to know. I appreciate seeing that too. It's very nice context for seeing what kind of properties this would affect.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
So, I want to note that the average score of our properties is a 90.2. So in general, the department's portfolio is in really good shape. And we need to focus in on, those that are not in good shape. And it is a very, very small percentage of the department's portfolio. Overall, people are really doing a good job.
That's really great.
There's way more 100s than below 70s.
Wonderful. Yeah, it was nice to see that spread. I found it very encouraging, actually. So yeah, thank you so much for all these changes and talking it through today.
It's nice for me to see that list too, because I never see the ones that have 100s.
I know. Yeah. There's lots. Yes, there's lots of compliant properties in our portfolio, and so you tend to deal with those that are not doing it. So
right.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. And yeah, we obviously agree with your overall thrust of just wanting these properties to be great for tenants. And I can tell that that's, you know, what you're doing with these changes. So really appreciate that.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else? Anything? Okay. Well, then I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. We will post this to the department's website. And I think that what we'll do next is provide a deadline for people to email us and provide us with any kind of input. And then we will move forward with bringing this to our governing board. And I don't think we're going to give too much time because basically it sounds like the people who were interested in participating in this didn't really have a lot of questions. So with that, thank you all for listening and happy Friday. Okay.
Thanks,
Renee,
Patricia.
thank you. How do we stop recording this? Can you do that?
Yes, I will end the webinar.
Thank you.
I think. Hold on. Oh, I'm ending it.
Thanks.
Bye, you guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye, Jeff.